They marched across continents. Not with gold, not with swords, but with solace. Rome did not conquer the world barefoot. Beneath every legionnaire's armor, beneath every senator's robe, beneath the emperor himself, sandals. Not one kind, 17, each telling a story. Each soaked in dust, blood, and history. Roman sandals were not mere footwear. They were armor for the feet, symbols of rank, signifiers of purpose. To understand them is to understand Rome's endless march through time. They were statements crafted for war, for ceremony, for style, for status. One could almost tell a Romang's occupation, class, and reputation by the stitching across his instep. You see, these weren't just shoes. The caligae. Laced up like a predator's jaw, iron-studded at the sole, it echoed across the cobblestones like thunder. These were the sandals of the Roman soldier, the sandals of Caesar's legions. Made of thick leather, open for breathability, but armored for resilience. Even shoes ornamental. They were the Roman version of slippers, the mark of a citizen at leisure. The soleae whispered rather than marched. Their quietness was their charm. The soleae were loud in appearance, but soft in use. A kind of defiance against the harshness of Rome's streets. They were not designed for comfort, but for conquest. The higher the sole, the greater the role. I enjoy. And the cothurni were the silent chorus beneath every actor's stride. And in the world they built, no detail was too small. Open like the soleae, but with straps that wrapped around the ankle. Comedic cothurni were flat. Tragic ones were platformed. Drama began at the feet. Let us begin with the most iconic of them all. The Romans had a name for everything. They lacked the finesse of the capital. No embroidery. The empire was built not just by emperors, but by the people who wore these. No dyes, more elegance. Just function, durable, perfect for those who worked the land, herded sheep, or walked endless miles, decorated, oiled to shine, still ready for war but touched by rank. A balance of beauty and function. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, the third emperor of Rome, was better known by his childhood nickname, Caligula. Little boot? Part 2. The caligae boots of the Empire Gaul, often worn with woolen socks or wraps. Britannia, the empire that adapted, that absorbed, that survived. Rome brought its sandals to the snows and the Perrones were born. Germania, the sandal had to adapt. This was the war boot. The soles were nailed with hobnails metal studs that clanked ominously and crushed resistance underfoot. Their red color denoted power, the same red as the border of a toga praetexta. No one below a certain rank could wear them. Even emperors couldn't resist their symbolism. Part 3. The soleae, the sandals of home. On philosophers pacing porches, on lovers fleeing across garden paths. The crepidae were everywhere, and thus often overlooked, but they were the pulse of Roman daily life. Now imagine Rome at rest, the forum, but at home it was a different world. There the soleae meant civility, ease, and privilege, the baths. The shade of a portico. Here, another kind of sandal ruled, the soleae. These were simple slip-ons, worn indoors or for casual errands. To wear soleae in public was frowned upon. It was like showing up to the Senate in a nightgown. Part 4. The soleae fashion over function. What if you didn't want the clack of nails or the dust of the street? What if you wanted softness? Style? The soleae. Closed toe, made from softer materials, the soleae were a favorite of the upper class. They were dyed in bright colors. Embroidered, padded, but beware, these were not worn by soldiers. They were for those who did not labor. To wear them was to say, I do not walk far, I do not fight, I do not suffer. Part 5. The cothurni theater for the feet on stage. Everything was illusion, especially height. The cothurni were high-soled sandals worn by actors, particularly in tragedy. Their thick soles elevated the performer physically and symbolically. These shoes were exaggerated. Theater in Rome was more than entertainment. It was politics, spectacle, morality play. Part 6. The crepidae utility and elegance. The crepidae were a blend, not as martial as the caligae, not as soft as the soleae. They creaked when you walked, thus the name. Worn by commoners and travelers, they were versatile. In mosaics, you'll find them on feet walking to market. Part 7. The carbatinae, the peasant's path simple, rustic, crude. The carbatinae were sandals made from a single piece of leather, folded and laced, worn by the poor, the provincial, the enslaved. But they were quick to make, easy to mend. In the dirt roads of the empire, far from Rome's marble heart, the carbatinae were Rome, Part 8. The campagus march of the officers similar to the caligae, but finer in construction. The campagus was the officer's choice, higher ankle coverage. Fewer hobnails. These sandals were authority wrapped in leather. They were not issued to the rank and file. They were signs of command. An officer might have his campagus custom made. When one approached, his sandals announced his role before his mouth did. Part 9. The Perone's northern adaptation. Rome reached cold lands. The Perones were enclosed, sometimes fur-lined. Less elegant, more practical, designed to keep out the cold and wet. They were the empire's compromise. They tell the story of Rome's flexibility. Part 10. The mille only for the highest read, always read. The mille were reserved for the highest magistrates. They were not for walking far, they were for being seen. For sitting in judgment, for standing on marble steps. To wear the mille without the right to do so was not just improper, it was illegal. The color of authority, the weight of law, woven into a pair of shoes. They were not sandals. They were armor for the feet, iron-bound, leather-strapped, brutal in function, and yet, in their own way, elegant. The caligae, the military sandals of the Roman legion, were not just footwear, they were instruments of expansion. From Britannia's bitter moors to the scorching sands of Parthia, it was the caligae that beat a rhythm into the earth. 1,000 pairs, striking stone roads with perfect precision, hammering the empire's will into the landscape. The sound was unmistakable, stitched tight to endure the wear of unpaved roads and hostile terrain. Beneath them, hobnails dozens per shoe gripped the earth like teeth. They clattered on the marble of temples, clinked over bridges of wood, and crushed the gravel of mountain passes into fine Roman dust. The pulse of Pax Romana began at the heel of conquest. Not like the airy sandals of the beach or the delicate slippers of the wealthy, but exposed in deliberate design. Soldiers needed ventilation in the Mediterranean heat, and they needed to dry their feet quickly after river crossings. But this also meant exposure to mud, frost, and blood. Many a foot blistered in the march from Gaul to Germania. Many a toe blackened in the alpine cold. Others laced sandals in the desert fashion, broad-strapped and loose. But even these, over time, became Romanized. By the reign of Trajan, many auxiliaries wore modified caligae, a sign that they were part of something greater than tribe or tongue, of empire. But the centurion? Hadrian, who walked the empire from end to end, wore them long after protocol demanded he should wear only the senatorial calceus. They were reminders of where power began. The son of the beloved Germanicus, little Gaius toddled about the camps in miniature caligae, dressed like the soldiers he grew up among. They adored him, called him Caligula, Little Boots, a name of affection. Caligula's rule became a boot stamped upon the throat of the Senate. He never earned the caligae through service. He inherited them, he corrupted them, or wrapped their caligae in cloth. Rome, master of roads and ritual, adapted when it had to. And the caligae, rough and heavy, were its heartbeat. New types of footwear emerged, boots for parades, for ceremony, for court appearances. They glittered, embroidered, and dyed. But they were not caligae. Command was fractured. Footwear became regional again. The old leather straps of the caligae gave way to stitched boots of cloth and hide. Rome was changing. They were not made to march. The sound of sandals, once a boast, could become a death sentence in the trees, abandoned on roads, lost in the peat bogs of the north, where they would wait centuries to be found, in the minds of those who dream of ancient thunder rolling down cobbled roads. His were different, more decorated, more tightly laced, sometimes dyed darker, sometimes adorned with studs and patterns that marked command, the soleae, the crepita, and now the mighty caligae. The boots of authority could not look too similar to those of the lead. Rome knew the importance of hierarchy, even in leather, fit not for war, but for the polished floors of the domus, for parties, for poetry, for flirtation and subtle scandal. When the legions marched, and march they did, buried with fallen legionaries, they survive in the peat and the ash, the hobnails rusted but intact. We know the paths the legions took, not from scrolls or imperial decrees, but from footprints caligae pressed into ancient soil. A faint but firm imprint of the Roman war machine. These were not built for luxury. The soleae were thick, layered with multiple pieces of leather, but make no mistake, the caligae were pain as much as power. They were open, yet still they marched. Even in death, the caligae told Thales. It is often said that the army built Rome more than any senate ever did. And that army was carried, quite literally, by its sandals, but not every soldier wore the same pair. The rank and file, the miles gregarious, the common legionary had standard issue caligae, and there were those who never wore caligae at all. Auxiliaries, non-citizen troops recruited from the edges of the empire often brought their own styles. Some wore boots of felt or hide, better suited for cold northern winds. But there were moments when even the legion's sandals fell silent. In the Germanic forests, where mist curled between pine trunks and silence was survival, hobnailed soleae gave way to softer treads. Scout speculators might remove their shoes altogether, and yet it was the caliga that symbolized the Roman soldier more than any sword or helmet. The great emperors, those born of the legions, never forgot it. Septimius Severus, raised from the provinces, remembered the caligae when he reshaped the army. And then, of course, there was Gaius, the boy who would become Caligula. He wore them not as a soldier, but as a mascot. But affection in Rome often curdled. By the time he took the throne, that nickname, once innocent, was an omen. In time, even the symbol of the soldier's sandal grew dark. As the empire stretched beyond what the legions could hold, the soul of Rome was in the dust and sweat of the road. But they too would fade. By the 4th century, the military sandal had begun to vanish. The legions were no longer what they were. Citizen soldiers had become mercenaries. And when Rome fell, not all at once, but in pieces, in whispers, in migrations, the caligae were left behind, buried in camps. And so we find them today, in glass cases of museums. In the pages of archaeology journals, 17 sandals. We have seen the calcaeus, yet more await. In the villas of the elite, another sandal stirs, lighter, finer. But that, dear sleeper, is a story for tomorrow's step. Rome was a city of orders, and every order had its own sound. The clatter of caligae on the stone road spoke of conquest. The deliberate tread of calcae across the Senate floor whispered of law, a more delicate rhythm. Their names were less formal, their styles more varied. Here, in the privacy of perfumed halls and mosaic-covered atriums, sandals became more than mere function. They became fashion, the hushed grace of luxury. But within the villas, beyond the noise of the streets and the politics of the forum, another sound was heard. It was a declaration, loud in its silence. I do not walk like you, I glide a softer step. In a world where sandals often defined duty, the sophist declared leisure. The deeper the red, the more prestigious the source. The dye came from rare mollusks, crushed and fermented to produce the imperial hue. It was costly. Styled their hair and laced their sandals with precision. Some sandals had gold-threaded straps, others bore tiny bells or carved ivory inlays. There was a kind of sandal known only in whispers, the peronium. A single-strap sandal worn high on the thigh for effect as much as fashion. Scandalous. A reminder. They were for the journey to the forum or the sudden escape from fire, or perhaps a symbolic act during Saturnalia when masters pretended to be slaves. Even the softest-footed Roman knew luxury was a mask, beneath it lay duty. There were senators who had cobblers from Alexandria and Cordoba compete in style. And there were sandals, rare and absurd, made not of leather at all but of woven silver, not worn, not needed but symbolic. A sign that even in death the journey continued, that the soul in Roman belief still walked, still moved. And it would need proper footwear to enter the afterlife with dignity, fragile, impractical, of choices, of movement, and of stillness. Worn perhaps only once, at one feast, we'll step beyond the villas, past the glittering halls of the wealthy, and into the workshops, where sandals were born. where hands shaped them, where tools scraped and dyes stained and cobblers whispered about emperors and grain shortages and the shape of a foot. To impress one enemy or win one fleeting moment of admiration, or fear, deliberately so. To wear red on your feet was to trample the earth in wealth. They were part of the choreography of seduction, often dyed or stitched with symbols of the household gods. The more delicate, the more loved. In this way, even sandals marked affection. And in Rome, leisure was a privilege few could afford but all admired. These were the sandals of the domus, the elite Roman home. It was a soft slipper, open or closed at the toe, sometimes with a thin sole of cork or leather, and most importantly, utterly silent. It made no noise when gliding across marble floors. It left no mark on the polished stones of a senator's private bath. By the 3rd century CE, sandals had grown flamboyant. Patterns were stamped into the soleae, leaving imprints in the dust shaped like dolphins, eagles, even imperial sigils. You could follow the tracks of a patrician through the courtyard by the images their sandals left behind. Fashion had become statement: no gold, no red. No silk. He believed indulgence dulled the mind. To him, sandals should serve the journey, not elevate the ego. It was the favored footwear of actors, poets, and philosophers, and eventually of emperors. Among them was the elegant soleae. The soleae was not a sandal in the strictest sense. At first, the soleae was frowned upon, too Greek, too theatrical, worn by those who performed rather than governed. The Romans, always cautious of appearing unmanly or decadent, viewed the soleae as a dangerous indulgence. But time softens all things, even prejudice. And in the late Republic, it found its way onto the feet of Rome's most powerful. Emperor Caligula, in his spiral of godhood and cruelty, wore red soleae in public, an outrageous break from tradition. To wear soft shoes was to declare that your feet need not labor, that you did not march, that you had people for such things. It was tied higher on the leg, cut for mobility but with style. Often worn by officers or equestrians, it balanced practicality with poise. The campagus might bear decoration, a stitched pattern, a colored lace. Subtle signs of wealth that only the educated eye could detect. Yet the soleae was not alone. There was the campagus, a hybrid between the rugged caligae and the dignified calceus. In elite homes, red-dyed sandals marked distinction. Women's sandals, too, entered a different world behind closed doors. Roman women of means owned ornatresses, personal slaves who dressed them. The poet Ovid once wrote of lovers who slipped off sandals like secrets. In these homes, sandals were not just worn. Even children of the elite had their sandals, miniature versions of their parents' shoes. But for all the softness of luxury, Rome's elite never fully forgot the road. In every villa, there hung beside the door a small pair of rough-soled sandals. Some emperors rejected the soft walk altogether. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, reportedly wore plain sandals in his chambers. Yet even Marcus could not halt the tide. And Rome, as always, loved the spectacle. There were gladiators whose sandals were custom-laced for dramatic effect. And then there were the funeral sandals. In the tombs of the elite, sandals were placed at the feet of the dead. 17 sandals. And so far we have wandered through 8. Each tells a story not of greatness, always but of life. In the next part of our journey, because a sandal is never just a sandal, it is a mirror of the one who wears it and of the world they walk through. Before the sandals walked, they were shaped. Before they touched stone, they knew fire. Before Rome ever rose, the shoemaker's knife was already carving the empire's first steps. The sandal, so often associated with war, politics, or wealth, began always in one place, the tabernae of the suitor, the sandal maker's workshop. The walls were hung with strips of hide ox, goat, and sometimes even exotic skins traded from far-off lands. Tools lay in orderly disarray: curved knives, thick awls, bone punches, and copper nails. A cobbler's hammer sat within reach at all times, not just for building solace, but for fixing history to the foot. These workshops were small, often dark, their ceilings low and heavy with the scent of leather and oil. Too few, and the soldier would slip. Too many, and the sandal would weigh him down in battle. Balance was everything. The work began with silence. Not just its length, but its arch, its angles, its flaws. Was this foot destined for war or worship? A bad sandal rubbed raw? Names passed between households. Working on cramped streets near the markets of Subura or the river docks of Ostia, their customers were farmers, merchants, dockhands, midwives, scribes. They made sandals not of splendor, but of necessity, letters sent, slaves dispatched to secure a commission before another client could claim the artisan's time. Cheap, quick, functional, yet when made well, they lasted years. The poor wore them, so did shepherds and travelers. So did sometimes philosophers who rejected finery on principle, and for the wealthiest, those who wore gold-threaded soleae or red-dyed caligae, the suitor, might be kept on retainer, fed and housed in exchange for exclusivity, news of grain prices, of troop movements, a footprint on the floor, never taken again. It was a moment lost in fire, but preserved in ash, of senators' affairs, sometimes buried with the dead, that sandal makers in his district were neglecting military orders in favor of a shipment intended for the imperial household. It seems even the emperor's sandals had to wait in line. A good pair was not discarded, it was lived in until it could no longer be shaped. A sandal fitting was an intimate act. People spoke when their feet were bare. While Rome shouted in marble and blood, the sandal makers whispered history in leather. These were offered in temples, burned as sacrifice, hung from shrines. One sandal, bronze-plated and gilded, was found in a tomb of a retired general, too stiff to walk in. Made only to remind the gods, I once marched far for Rome, and so the sandal maker became a quiet historian, a keeper of the city's rhythm, its gossip, its weariness. A good one became invisible. Would it pace the forum or descend into catacombs? Would it crush grapes at harvest or tread softly through incense-laden temples? Into the countryside where sandals took on simpler shapes but deeper stories. The suitor studied the foot of his client. Remade in local fashion, yes, but always bearing a piece of the workshop where it began, every sole cut by eye, a sign of pride where none was required. Something that remembered the shape of your life long after you'd forgotten where you'd walked. Not a signature, but a symbol, a sunburst, a sheaf of wheat, a tiny fish. Rome was always held together by the feet of the farmer. A silent boast that this sandal was shaped with care, that it would walk far and well. The awl used to pierce strap holes, wore its handle smooth with use. There was reverence in the workshop. No altar, but a rhythm of reverence for leather, for motion, for utility. Every strap trimmed by touch. Apprentices might help with basic prep, boiling water for soaking, oiling hides, sweeping scraps, but only the master suitor shaped the final piece. His hands bore scars like the sandals bore steps, long, layered, and quietly earned. Each purpose required a different shape. For the sturdy caligae, the soleae were thick and wide, reinforced with hobnails that had to be placed precisely. The leather had to be soaked, cut, and then stitched while still damp, so it would mold as it dried. The loops for laces were carefully punched, not too close to the edge, lest the strap tear under the weight of status. The elegant calceus, on the other hand, required stitching so fine it was almost invisible. Even the simplest soleae had its precision, and there was no such thing as mass production. Every pair of sandals was handmade. A good suitor was sought after. But most sandal makers were ordinary craftsmen, and even there, in the simplest work, was art. The sandals known as carbatinae were the most basic of all single pieces of hide, folded up around the foot, slit at the sides for lacing. And as humble as they were, even the carbatinae bore the imprint of the maker's hand. A slight curve here, a cleaner stitch there. Sometimes, hidden beneath the sole, the suitor would press his personal mark. The tools of the trade were passed down through generations. The cobbler's knife, when honed over decades, took on a shine like polished bone. And in these spaces, stories were exchanged with each stitch. The suitor heard everything. Sometimes, the sandals outlived the people. In Pompeii, after the eruption, a workshop was found frozen in time. A sandal half cut on the bench. Leather curled beside it. We know from excavation that sandals were repaired, resold, and relaced countless times. They were passed down. Sometimes shared between siblings. Even emperors had their sandals repaired. A letter from a provincial governor, preserved in a scrap of papyrus, complains. Some sandals were ceremonial, made not to be worn but to represent 17 types. So many born in these quiet shops, amid the scratch of knives and the flicker of oil lamps. And as the empire stretched to its furthest edges, it carried with it not just laws or legions but the Roman sandal. A sandal was never just something worn, it was something crafted, something touched by hands you'd never meet. In the next part, we will travel away from the cities, away from the cobbled roads, because while emperors marched and senators debated, there was another Rome, not the Rome of Senate decrees or imperial processions, not the Rome of marble temples or howling mobs in the amphitheater. This Rome did not shout, it breathed. Slowly, in the furrows of wheat, in the shadows of olive groves, in the sigh of a shepherd watching the sun fold itself behind the hills of Latium. Worn by contadini, the free tenant farmers who scratched out a living from land that was often not theirs. Worn by slaves who worked from first light to last and owned nothing, not even the sandals on their feet. And here too, there were sandals. They were not red. They did not glitter. They had no ivory clasps or embroidered soleae. They were cut from whatever leather was cheapest or, sometimes from rope, bark, or stitched together scraps of cloth. They had no names in the official records, but they had names in the villages. It had been tied together with string and tucked beneath a stone slab. No grave, no inscription. Only the hint of a story, perhaps a lost child or a wish made in the absence of hope, until the straps wore down and the solace cracked, and they were patched again with whatever could be found. They were never thrown away, not while a single step remained in them. And some, in the poorest regions, had no soul at all, just the illusion of a shoe, a hope against thorns and burning ground. Rusticae, some called them. Country sandals? The leather was dried beside the fire, mended with care. Some families kept the same pair for years, passed from father to son, or from brother to sister if the times were lean. In the early mornings, as the fields turned silver with dew, these sandals stirred, even today, even now, or the gold-laced slippers of the emperors, but the quiet crunch of sandals in the morning dust. The calm step of someone who walks not to conquer, but simply to live, to gather figs, to visit a neighbor, to tend a vine planted by a father long gone. But some still craft the old shapes, leather cut by hand. Straps looped not for show, but for survival. These sandals do not sit in museums. They do not earn inscriptions. The sandals of the countryside were made with function as the only god, wide solace for balance. Thick laces wrapped around calves, not for fashion but for endurance, so they wouldn't slide loose in the mud or among the vines. Wrote of farmers whose sandals gathered dust while they played the flute beneath trees. Augustus had coins struck showing him in simple garments and plain sandals, though his were certainly stitched by the best hands in Rome, they pretended. For a day to be of the earth, it was a ritual, yes, but also a memory of where they had come from, of what Rome was before it built walls of marble. The illusion mattered more than the truth. Of lovers who met at twilight, their sandals tangled beside them in the grass. Of rustic gods who walked among mortals, disguised not in gold but in plain hide sandals and homespun cloaks. It aged with them, leather darkened with sweat and soil. The imprint of toes pressed deeper each season. A sandal that fit well was priceless not for its beauty, but for its comfort in a world with little ease. Some were open-toed, some were little more than foot wrappings with thin leather pads tied underneath. But still, they walked. Up rocky slopes to shepherd sheep, into tiny shrines nestled among cypress trees. They walked to funerals, to feasts, to markets on the outskirts of Rome where grain was weighed and olives pressed beneath worn wooden beams. They walked behind plows and across riverbeds. Unlike the soldier or senator, the farmer never removed his sandals for show. He took them off to sleep, to pray, to die. A painted band of color. A small metal coin sewn into the strap to ward off evil. Superstition was more common in the countryside than law. The gods were older out here, and sandals were sometimes left as offerings to them hung on trees, burned with herbs, buried at crossroads. And though there were no great names among these sandals, some bore marks nonetheless, not of nobility, but of pride. A stitched flower. In one ruin outside Cumae, archaeologists found a child's sandal beside a clay doll. These country sandals also had seasons. In winter, the peasants wore simple boots or wrapped their feet in wool and cloth. But in the spring and summer, when grain sprouted and vines thickened, sandals returned. A pair of sandals in the countryside might walk 1,000 miles and never leave a 10-mile radius. They traced the same path, house, field, river, temple, again and again. Unlike in the cities, where a broken strap could be replaced in a market stall, here the sandal became part of the person. And yet, these sandals were not always forgotten. The poet Virgil, himself born in the countryside near Mantua. Even emperors, in times of propaganda, liked to imagine themselves as sons of the soil. And during the great festivals Saturnalia, Vinalia, Floralia, even the rich sometimes dressed down. They wore simpler tunics, simpler sandals. They feasted with their slaves. For even the greatest city begins with bare feet and broken sandals. In the countryside, some still walk barefoot, but they remain. And as you sleep tonight, picture not the thunder of the legions, a Rome that does not end in ruin, a sandal that does not seek glory, only peace. Not all sandals walked. Some stood, still, silent, waiting in temples of marble and shadow, where the air never stirred and time bent its knee to ritual. Not the sandals that climbed the hills of the Palatine or traced the streets of Subura, but the divine also had feet, and those feet were not bare. These were sacred sandals, shaped not for the world, but for the gods. These were not the sandals of battle or marketplace. In Rome, the divine had many faces: Mars, stern and bloodstained; Venus, perfumed and secretive; Jupiter, throned above thunder. Even the statues of the gods, carved from stone, wore sandals, and so did those who served them. The most powerful among them, the flamen Dialis, served Jupiter himself. Nor could they be made of the hide of any animal that had died in unnatural ways. No iron was allowed in their stitching. He was bound by oaths, by rules, and yes, by his sandals. They were untouched, new, bound to her even as earth was piled over her head, singing hymns and leaping into the air with ritualistic precision. Their sandals were strapped high, wrapped up the calf in overlapping leather thongs, fastened with red and bronze. Not practical, not comfortable, but spectacular. They were not meant to impress, but they carried weight nonetheless. Simple, but symbolic, often worn only when facing east. The direction of the rising sun, the beginning of all omens. For if a Vestal let the flame die, or broke her vow of chastity in the temples and altars, they became part of the divine conversation. She was not stripped of her robes, she was buried alive. If he had walked through a graveyard or stepped in blood outside the ritual, the sandals were burned, anointed with oils and carefully fitted with sandals often plain, but sometimes special. Sometimes they're stylized, almost glowing, but always present. It was believed the soul had to walk the Via Sacra, the sacred road to the afterlife, and for that it needed proper shoes. If he entered the temple of Cybele, he did so barefoot, for the goddess required humility. They were white, unblemished, the color of divine purity, but they were heavy with restriction. He could not touch a corpse. Strapped not for speed, but for sanctity. He could not ride a horse. He could not sleep outside Rome's walls. The sandals were not a path, they were a boundary. To wear sandals became something else entirely: Greek, Egyptian, Syrian, Germanic, on feast days. He wore red-dyed sandals, often made of the finest leather, padded with felt, inscribed on the sole with symbols of state: eagles, thunderbolts, laurels. These sandals were not made for walking. They were made to be seen. Even the knots had meaning, ritualized, deliberate, each loop a symbol, each twist a safeguard against impurity. And when he crossed into the temple, he removed those sandals, because no matter how powerful he was in the world, before the gods he must be bare. He wore a white robe, a peculiar conical cap called the apex, and most important of all, a pair of forbidden sandals. At the center of this sacred web were the Flamens Rome's high priests, each devoted to a specific deity. Forbidden because these sandals, once tied, could not be undone in public. The Flamen Dialis was not a free man in the usual sense. And then there were the Vestal versions. He wore ceremonial sandals of red, mimicking the god Jupiter. But tradition demanded that as he rode in glory, a slave stood behind him and whispered, "Memento mori, remember you are mortal." 6 women, chosen as children, sworn to 30 years of celibacy and sacred duty. Their task, to keep the flame of Vesta burning the hearth of Rome, its spirit. They wore flowing white robes and elaborate braided hairstyles, and on their feet subtle sandals made of soft white leather, laced delicately. They were not ornate. And the sandals she wore into the tomb? Not all ceremonial sandals were bound to such darkness. The soleae, priests of Mars, were Rome's dancing priests. Clad in archaic armor and feathered helmets, they'd process through the streets every march. Each step was not a movement, it was a prayer. And the augurs, those who read the will of the gods in the flight of birds and the crackle of thunder, they too had their sandals. Sandals were not just clothing in Rome. Even sacrificial rituals had rules for sandals. The priest leading the offering must have clean, dedicated footwear. But most dramatic of all were the sandals worn by the emperor as Pontifex Maximus. The emperor, as head of Roman religion, had ceremonial garments laced with deep meaning. The emperor walked slowly, deliberately across the Pomerium, the sacred boundary of Rome. And then there were the sandals of death. When a Roman general was honored with a triumph, a parade through the city, the sandals were reminders too, red like blood, bound like fate. Even the dead wore sandals. When a body was placed on the funeral bier, the feet were washed. In tombs across the empire, especially in the catacombs of early Christians, we find sandals carved into sarcophagi. Sometimes the straps are too ornate to be real. The foot must walk, even in death. The soul must tread, even in silence. 17 sandals. And these ceremonial ones are perhaps the least walked and yet the most enduring. Bound not by dust, but by meaning. In the next part of our journey, we will step outside the borders of Rome, to the edges of empire, where Roman straps met foreign soleae and changed. Because sandals, like empires, never stay in one shape. It is easy to think of Rome as marble and order, of sandals clacking in perfect rhythm across the forum, of statues watching the passage of power, of streets paved in stone and lined with law. But Rome was more than Rome. Beyond the city's gates, past the tidy boundaries of the Pomerium, past the farm villas and aqueducts, the sandals of empire changed. They were still Roman, but touched by something else. Something older, wilder. The open-toed sandals of the Mediterranean were no match for British reign. Soldiers stuffed wool into them, wrapped cloth around their feet. Some even stitched felt linings or added leather flaps across the top, creating a sort of closed hybrid provincial. Worn down, pierced by iron studs, but still whole. Among them, children's sandals, their straps tiny and curved. Women's light and thin, and soldiers' thick, reinforced, patterned like the very roads they patrolled. We see figures walking in sandals that are not quite Roman, but not entirely foreign either. Their straps form unfamiliar patterns. Their soles are thicker, often painted red or yellow. Cultural fusion, stitched one foot at a time, but of woven papyrus or palm as had been done for centuries. Roman officials stationed here often wore sandals fashioned in the native style broad, with curled tips and decorated heels. It was not uncommon to find Roman insignia burned into a sandal made from reeds. When sandals were worn, they were reinforced, often with double soleae, stitched with resin-soaked thread to resist water and rot. Here, on the frontiers in dusty forts, frozen garrisons, and distant colonial towns, the Roman sandal adapted. It had to. They were daily tools softened by mud, cracked by frost, but always walked in. Meant to leave a specific imprint in the dust, a sacred shape. A common provincial design was the campagus hispanicus, a sandal with broad lacing, often made from local goat leather, prized for its toughness. A sign? They were utilitarian? Yes, but often decorated with bronze studs or even tiny bells. Sandals here were more symmetrical. A rare innovation, but one that spoke to the cleverness of Romanized tribes adapting old ways to new needs. often with a loop across the top of the foot and a separate piece wrapping the heel. This created a more balanced weight, ideal for long walks over the hilly terrain, said to ward off spirits in the dark mines of the Sierra Morena. Caligae, calcae, soleae, they survived in name, but in shape they had mutated. These sandals would outlast the empire itself, and some versions still echo in designs worn by desert monks today. Some speculate these were not just for traction, but for defense. In the forests of the north, where every shadow might hide a spear, even your sandals became armor. We descend into the places where sandals were both shield and shackle, the feet of the servant, the slave, the criminal. The sound of a Roman sandal was no longer a threat. It was an echo, a suggestion of order, a memory of power, a whisper that once long ago a road had connected this place to the very heart of the world. In Britannia, where the cold wet earth swallowed hobnails and numbed the toes, soldiers modified their caligae. Adaptation, even diplomacy. Archaeologists at Vindolanda, a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall, have uncovered dozens of these sandals. These were not parade shoes, not for necessity, for pride, beneath ash, beneath sand, beneath modern streets, waiting, stitched from a single piece, tied at the ankle. It was flexible, comfortable, and ideal for walking across dry terrain. Originally used by local peoples, Roman officials and traders adopted it quickly. It became a mark of adaptation, not weakness. Sand burned, stone tore through soft solace. The sandals that survived were often simpler flat, wide-soled with high straps to keep out dust. Some had toe loops, others were tied with wool cords that could be replaced easily when they frayed. Farther east in Syria and Judea, the story changed again. Here, heat ruled. A style emerged in the east that Romans adopted, the aluda sandala soft leather shoe, in the mosaics of Antioch and Palmyra, and then there were the sandals of Africa. Along the Nile, in the heat of the Egyptian frontier, sandals took on even older shapes. Some were made not of leather. Here, footwear became a symbol of something more complex than identity. It was survival. The Copts, early Christian Egyptians, developed their own sandals during late Roman rule, distinctive for their cross-laced straps. To walk at the edge of Rome was to walk in uncertainty. Sandals had to match the terrain and the politics. In Germania, soldiers sometimes abandoned sandals altogether for fur-lined boots made from thick hide. The winters were not survivable otherwise. The finds from Carnuntum, a Roman military camp in modern Austria, show sandals with exaggerated hobnails sharp, sometimes even barbed. And yet, even here, fashion survived. A sandal uncovered near the Danube bore a stamped pattern in the leather, a stylized valve, perhaps a tribute to Rome herself. The strap had been dyed red. In the Iberian provinces, sandals adapted once again. The rocky terrain of Hispania required durable soles, but its dry climate allowed for openness. Traders and miners wore these, as did soldiers and farmers. And in Gaul, another style appeared, the Gallic cross strap. Some Gallic sandals had removable soles, fastened with pins. The empire's sandals did not conquer, they blended. And in that blending they endured. By the 3rd century, Roman sandals across the provinces bore more in common with their local cousins than with the original forms of the Republic. Rome had walked so far it had forgotten what its own feet once looked like, but the sandals remembered. In the border towns, in the trading posts, in the synagogues and bathhouses and temples of distant lands, and somewhere still, those sandals rest, waiting to be found. Next, we return from the edge to the home, but not the villas of the rich. Because not every Romang walked freely. They walked beside senators, but not as equals. They stood behind generals, but were never seen. Their hands bore the burdens, their sandals bore the silence. Not every Romang walked in freedom, and not every sandal walked by choice. The world beneath the empire, the kitchens, the quarries, the farms, the palaces, was sustained by millions of men, women, and children who did not own their names, much less their sandals. They were the servi, the slaves of Rome, and though the law said they were property, their feet still touched the same stones as emperors. Their sandals, if they had them, tell the forgotten half of Rome's story. Some were barefoot from birth to grave. In the mines of Sardinia, where convicts and slaves alike were sent to dig out silver and sulfur, sandals were often forbidden. The jagged rocks tore flesh, the cold pierced bone. But sandals, the overseers believed, were too generous. Too easy an escape, bare feet bled more slowly, they left clearer tracks. That they walked, that they once touched the world? Quiet gifts. If he ran, he could be branded. And if he was caught stealing sandals, the punishment could be blinding. The only ones allowed. In the vast latifundia, the agricultural estates that fed the empire slaves sometimes wore rope sandals, twisted from hemp or palm fibers. These lasted mere weeks. Friction from plows, thorns from vines, heat from the ground wore them away. And yet, these sandals were repaired again and again with strips of bark, sinew, cloth. Trainees wore reinforced sandals with gripping soleae, meant for agility. But before the games, those sandals were replaced with thin-soled, flimsy ones, so they would fall faster. Brought to Rome as tutors or scribes, sometimes earned wages. With enough, they might buy proper sandals crepidae. Open-topped, often not to buy a home or take a lover, but to buy sandals, a pair made for them, custom fit. A freedman might walk with his back straight and his sandals polished, but still be barred from senate or command. The soleae said, "I was once owned." The scars did not fade. To walk the city no longer in shadow, symbolizing knowledge and refinement, of labor, of presence, was buried in a modest tomb with sandals on her feet, not gold, not red. Just leather, worn, honest, whole, of being alive in a world that denied it. A rare freedom, a risk. Because a sandal too fine on the wrong foot could draw a beating. To sandals shaped not for war, not for prayer, not for field or chain, but for the stage. The crowd preferred drama. These were worn by cooks, scribes, nurses, and concubines. They were not always provided by the master. Sometimes they were stitched in secret, using scraps stolen from the house cobbler's waist. Not for dignity, but for utility to prevent injury, to keep them moving. A limping slave was a liability. These sandals were rarely made to fit. They were passed down. If a servant died, his sandals were taken off before the body cooled. Never wasted. Never theirs. Some masters, especially in urban villas, provided their house slaves with basic leather sandals. Archaeologists found a row of sandals near a servant's room, 7 pairs, small, plain, repaired many times. One had a name scratched into the underside. Felix. Lucky, even in these, some tried to leave traces of themselves. Tiny etchings on the underside of the soleae name, a mark, a scratch like a star. Symbols to remind them that they were real. In the palaces of the rich, servants might wear soleae, the simple house slipper. A suitor's apprentice, himself enslaved, might shape a tiny pair for a lover or a child. The laws of Rome said nothing of sandal rights. But they said this, if a slave struck his master, he could be executed. Still, they walked. Through the streets where the filth of the city clung to their solace. Through the baths where they served the rich while forbidden to wash. Through the arenas where condemned slaves were given sandals before they died, so they wouldn't slip on blood. In the Ludus Magnus, the gladiator school, sandals were both weapon and chain, and yet some slaves rose. Educated Greek slaves, and then there were the freedmen. Those who had once served, but had earned or been granted freedom, their first act? Some even wore caligae, the closed-toe formal shoes of citizens, though the law frowned on this unless status permitted it. In one house in Pompeii, carbonized in the ash of Vesuvius, perhaps it was ironic, perhaps it was hopeful. Even in death, the sandals remained. Even in silence, they spoke. Because a sandal, for the servant, was more than a shoe. It was evidence they were rarely buried with sandals. That honor was for citizens. But sometimes, just sometimes, a master who loved a nursemaid or a slave who died saving a child, 17 types. We have now walked through 10. But in the next step, we rise again not to power or luxury, but to performance, where every strap was stylized and every step scripted. In the heart of the forum stood the grand stone theaters, curved like shells to catch voices and echo them into legend. These were places of illusion where stories rose like incense and sandals made men gods or fools. because on the Roman stage the foot lied as much as the face. The actor's sandal was no ordinary thing. It was not built for comfort. It was not made for walking cities or marching to war. The purpose was simple: to make the tragic hero larger than life a presence, a myth. Paired with elaborate masks and stiff robes, the sandals completed the illusion of someone beyond human. It was designed to deceive. The most famous were the cothurni. The cothurnus was strapped to the foot with tight wrappings that disappeared beneath the costume. To wear it in real life was to suggest weakness, effeminacy, or lack of discipline. But on stage it became a symbol of levity. Others, like Nero, wore it proudly, especially during performances of his own poetry. To Nero, every step was theater, of cleverness. The shoe of jesters, slaves, fools, and lovers. A profession of their own, they stitched for illusion, not endurance. Designed never to interrupt the music or distract from gesture. Some performers would glue fabric to their soleae to hush even the smallest step. Their work was often burned after the season, unless it was blessed by fame. A sandal worn by a beloved actor could become a relic, passed from troupe to troupe, until its sole cracked and its myth faded. The heel was flat, the sole thick, the weight uneven. Every step required poise. Every movement was a performance. Flexible, meant to allow fast movement, quick turns, exaggerated body gestures. Tall, towering, and strange, these platform sandals could lift an actor 6 to 10 inches above the ground. To fall from a tall pair of cothurni could mean broken bones or worse. Some died mid-performance, their sandals still strapped to their twisted feet, the audience unsure whether it was part of the show. To suffer in sandals so unnatural was somehow fitting. To see the shuffle of a soccus was to prepare for laughter, lust, or lies. The sandals set the tone before a single word was spoken. They were not easy to walk in. Made of cork, leather, and sometimes wood, to trip in a soccus at the wrong time was to ruin the joke. The sandals were not accessories. They were instruments. Women in the crowd might throw their own sandals onto the stage in approval or mockery. The most daring actors would collect them and wear them as part of their final scene, sometimes with a sigh between actor and citizen. But an actor, in the right sandals, could make thousands weep or laugh without drawing a sword. Between lie and truth, parodying their own craft-wearing absurdly tall platforms or shoes with wheels, slipping across makeshift stages to roars of laughter, only tragedians wore them. In contrast, actors in comedies wore the soccus, a soft, slipper-like sandal with a thin sole and no straps. It was quiet. We turn our eyes to sandals not made to be seen on foot, but worshipped on altars. The soccus was mocked in literature. A slave would wear rope sandals, dyed black, the color of sorrow. A god might go barefoot, or wear gilded sandals that shimmered as he strode across the scene, casting shadows that danced. Tailored not just to their role, but to their stride. A sandal that matched their unique timing, their signature pauses, their sudden turns. Some emperors disapproved of it altogether. Augustus banned Roman men from wearing the soccus offstage. Stage sandals had to match not just the actor, but the character. A general might wear mock caligae made from painted linen with felt soleae, too quiet for real battle, but impressive under torchlight. The most elaborate sandals were made by scenic cobblers. Sometimes sandals were hidden entirely. Mimes and pantomimes who performed without speech often danced barefoot. But when sandals were worn, they were silent, padded, and yet the stage was dangerous. In the chaos of open-air performances, especially in amphitheaters or street festivals, actors risked injury, but the audience always watched the sandals. They meant something. To see a man stride in cothurni was to expect fate, blood, and justice, and the audience played along. At the Floralia festival, where license ruled and nothing was sacred, a sandal, after all, could be a punchline. In the back alleys of Subura, the working-class district of Rome, informal stages were set up during Saturnalia. There, sandal makers joined the shows. Even here, the footwear mattered. The line between costume and character blurred. The greatest actors of the age, Roscius, Aesopus. Paris, the pantomime had sandals crafted specifically for them, because in Roman theater, every gesture was law, every footfall a decree. To walk without conviction in a pair of cothurni was to insult the gods. And when the performance ended, the actor would remove his sandals first. To step out of character was to unstrap the heel, loosen the cord, and place the shoes gently into their chest, sometimes with a prayer. Because while Rome judged its actors harshly, it could not deny their power. A general might win battles. A senator might command the courts. And when he died, sometimes his sandals were buried with him. Because even if he had only pretended to be a king, he had walked like one. Next, we leave the stage, but not performance. Because gods too wore sandals. And some were made not for walking, but for eternity. Not all sandals walked. Some were never meant to touch the ground. Some rested on altars for centuries, unworn, unweathered. But still, they held power. Because in Rome, the gods wore sandals, and those who served them never walked barefoot. In the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the heart of the Capitoline Hill, there stood, behind gold and stone, a colossal statue of the god, eyes of ivory, tunic of purple, and at his feet, sandals of solid gold, studded with lapis, lazuli, and sardonyx. They had no straps, no wear, no dirt. They were not for walking, they were for awe. To see the sandals of Jupiter was to feel the weight of Rome's destiny. They were cleaned daily by the flamens, high priests in tall conical caps. They were exaggerated, stylized, eternal. There were rules. They symbolized that even the gods, when they came to earth, came shod, because to walk barefoot was to be mortal, vulnerable, flawed, who treated the shoes with reverence, not as clothing, but as relics. Their holiness was in restriction, in discipline. One such incident, recorded in 92 BCE, led to an investigation and eventually a public execution. Rome did not forgive broken signs in the careful boundaries of leather and law. The priests known as Luperci ran through the streets of Rome half naked, lashing whips made of goat hide. They wore no tunics, but they did wear sandals made of the same goat's skin, freshly tanned, warm with blood. It was believed these sandals channeled the vitality of the sacrificed animal into the city itself. These were not imitations of human sandals, between sacred and savage. And gods were none of those things, but what of the priests? Initiates removed their worldly shoes and were given sandals bound with 7 straps, each representing a level of spiritual ascent. The tighter the bindings, the stronger the soul, but to touch before journeys, whispering a prayer to the swift god for favor. The final level, the pater, wore sandals embroidered with stars, for he had walked beyond this world. The whiteness symbolized purity, the untouched soul. There, a priestess reportedly wore a pair of sandals made from the hide of an animal never named, inscribed. It was said with a prayer only visible under moonlight, or a soul lost too soon offered to the messenger god, sandal-clad, watching, judging, unseen, who wore winged sandals himself. Hung over doors or placed in soldiers' pouches, for speed, for luck, for safe passage over land and sea. Before major ceremonies, these sandals were cleansed with salted water and hyssop, and the soleae sometimes anointed with myrrh. Their sandals were sacred too, but not golden. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest, wore white leather sandals known as caligae during public rituals. Archaeologists found a child's sandal, delicate, red-dyed, untouched by time, wrapped in linen and sealed in a stone box. No body, no inscription. He could not walk just anywhere in them. To enter certain shrines, he had to remove them. To ascend certain steps, he had to wear them in silence. Had their own sandals, soft, pale, and made of a unique fabric, woven wool mixed with fine leather, dyed white or ash gray. Their sandals had no buckles, only knots tied by acolytes. The knots themselves had ritual meaning, loops of fate, bonds of virginity, symbols of Rome's safety. To speak to the Vestals, he had to stand with feet together, the sandals aligned like offerings. The Vestal virgins, keepers of Rome's sacred fire, if a Vestal's sandal broke during ritual, it was seen as a dark omen. Some rituals demanded special shoes. During the Lupercalia, a wild festival of purification and fertility, to wear those sandals was to run between life and death. And yet, in the mystery cults of Rome, Mithraism, Isis worship, Dionysian rites, Sandals meant something even deeper: initiation, in the hidden temples of Mithras, carved into underground chambers. Not all divine sandals were worn by priests or statues. Some were buried, some were hidden. In the ruins of a small temple to Mercury, unearthed in southern Gaul, just the shoe. A votive offering, perhaps, from a parent praying for safe travels. And yes, Mercury's talaria, the winged sandals of flight, they were known across Rome, not just in myth, but in actual talismans. Miniature sandals with silver wings were sold in markets, worn around the neck. Even the Emperor Augustus, when traveling, was said to carry a pair of ceremonial sandals modeled after Mercury's, not to wear. In Rome, you did not need to wear the sandal to believe in it. But perhaps the most mysterious sacred sandal lies not in Rome, but in a story from the East. In Ephesus, once under Roman control, pilgrims came from across the empire to see the Temple of Artemis, one of the wonders of the world. The sandals disappeared after a fire. Some say they were stolen, others that they ascended with the goddess. No one knows. But even now, on ancient altars long silent, you can sometimes see faint imprints in stone, as if someone once stood there. So we have now walked through 17 types, 12 steps taken. And now we leave the temples and follow the sandals that moved not just people, but legions. We walk now with Rome's bureaucrats, with governors, with spies, because even paperwork has footsteps. They were not soldiers, they carried no spears. But when these men walked, the people stepped aside. Because the most dangerous sandals in Rome didn't march with the army. They walked the corridors of power. These were the sandals of the state, worn by officials, scribes, spies, ambassadors, and censors. Their leather left traces not on bloodied fields, but on the marble floors of senates, forums, and provincial palaces. And yet they changed more fates than legions ever could. The most well-known among them was the calcaeus senatorius, the senator's sandal. It was no ordinary shoe. Made of black leather, it was fully enclosed, reaching to the ankle, unlike the open-toed sandals of the common man. It had 4 leather thongs that wrapped around the leg and were tied just below the calf. There are stories of freedmen who dared to copy the sandal style and were beaten publicly, their shoes burned in the forum. To wear it was to signal one's rank immediately. And inside the binding, a small crescent-shaped buckle of ivory or gold, the lunula, but still marked them as elite men who could command cavalry, lead tribunals, and control vast wealth. It was subtle, but everyone saw it. A flash of privilege with every step. Only men of senatorial rank could wear the calcae with the lunula. To imitate them was a punishable offense. And then there were the equites, the Roman knights. Through their feet flowed news, commands, threats, and lies. Were those whose names were rarely known, the cursus publicus, the state courier service. It left an imprint with every step. On muddy roads, snow-covered passes, or dusty marble, one could trace their passage. Horses helped, but in mountainous regions or war zones, it was the foot that carried the word. These prints were recognized across provinces as signs of official business. They wore a similar style, but their sandals were dyed red or maroon and their buckles were made of bronze. Less grand than the senatorial black and gold, these calcae were stiff, often uncomfortable, but they were not made for comfort. Called perones, these were high-laced, open sandals with durable solace and leather straps that wrapped up to the shin, like a cross between soldier and runner. They were made to remind the wearer, you are being watched. But among the most crucial figures in the empire, the leather is cracked, but you can still see the imprint of the imperial sigil, faded but not gone. Their sandals were lighter, quicker, often custom-made, designed not for display, but speed. The couriers were Rome's arteries, and their sandals showed it. They carried blades, messages, poisons, and even coins. Each official courier had his sandals stamped on the sole with the emblem of the emperor, usually an eagle or a thunderbolt. They watched senators from rooftops, followed generals through cities, listened in forums, vanished before questions. Several have been found buried beneath Roman roads, sandals long vanished, names still sharp. But their sandals always betrayed them to those who knew. To harm a man wearing these sandals was to commit treason. In Egypt, governors wore sandals dyed with indigo and reinforced with papyrus soleae. In Dacia, where winters were harsh, they wore caligae lined with fur and wrapped in oiled wool. In Judea, where dust never rested, they used sandals coated in resin, so dirt would not cling to the sacred floor of synagogues. Their work was grueling. Some ran from Gaul to Rome in under 5 days, over 1,000 kilometers. A worn sandal was a badge of honor when he lied that the leather would betray him. In museums today, a few of these perrons survive. But Rome had other walkers. Not all official, not all honest. The speculators, imperial spies, and bodyguards wore sandals designed to look like common footwear. But inside the sole, hidden between 2 layers of leather, their sandals could kill or bribe. They were instruments of secrecy. No one knew exactly how many speculators there were. Some gladiators claimed they could spot a spy just by the way he walked. Then came the provincial governors, appointed by Rome to rule its scattered territories, from dusty Mauritania to icy Britannia. Their sandals changed depending on where they ruled, but all had one thing in common: a small silver tag on the sandal's heel, etched with their name and rank. If a governor was assassinated or died, these tags were often all that remained. One such tag, found near Ebracum, reads, Al Silvanus, propraetor, servant of Caesar. No records mention him, but his sandal did. Lastly, we must speak of the censors, the most feared officials in the Republic. They kept the census, assigned public contracts, and judged the morals of Rome's citizens. They wore white sandals, simple but symbolic. A reminder that their judgment must be unbiased, their steps unsullied by favor or fear. But Roman poets whispered that a corrupt censor's sandals would squeak whether true or not. No censor wanted squeaky shoes. So here we are, 11 parts in, 11 types walked. But next, we abandon the marble halls and dusty roads. We step into luxury and scandal. Because the most decadent sandals in Roman history were not worn in war or in worship or in the Senate. They were worn in the bedrooms of emperors. They whispered as they walked. Not with sound, but with shimmer. In the quiet chambers of Roman villas, behind silk curtains and mosaic floors, there existed sandals that were neither practical nor political, but purely pleasurable. Their purpose was not to protect the feet. Behind closed doors, in feasts, orgies, and moonlit gardens, Rome indulged in extremes. And so did its fashion. But to display them, to entice, to conquer in silence. A woman who bathed in milk and dined with diamonds in her hair. It is said that when she entered the emperor's chamber, she removed her sandals with a flick of her heel and left them pointed at the bed, by a Greek shoemaker from Alexandria. Was said to wear sandals with gilded soleae, the bottoms notched with her name. Not on top, where others could see, but below. Her lovers kissed them before she stepped over them, a ritual, a humiliation. Made from dyed leather, lined with crushed petals, but an innovation. The calcae feminae, women's shoes, were platforms, sometimes 5 inches high, used to elevate posture and avoid the grime of the streets. But in private, these platforms became instruments of play. And scented with attar of rose in one surviving example, discovered in a villa near Pompeii, a sandal heel held a tiny silver dagger no longer than a finger. They released fragrance with each step. These were the sandals of courtesans, concubines, and empresses. Syrian by birth, philosopher by nature, the leather is faded, the stars have dulled, but the soul bears a Latin inscription. She walked the marble corridors of power with sandals made of black silk and lioness hide, a symbol of both grace and ferocity. In a society that prized stoic dignity in public, the most infamous of these indulgent shoes were called the sandalia rosata, the rose sandals. They were said to have been invented during the reign of Emperor Nero. To walk in them was to perfume the room. In her temples, votive sandals were offered, not for protection, but for fertility. Women desperate for children would leave miniature shoes beneath her altar, whispering prayers into the leather. Especially under Hadrian and Commodus, wore jewel-studded sandals gifted in secret. One such lover, Antinous, wore sandals of blue-dyed leather, embroidered with swans and lotus flowers. When he drowned in the Nile, Hadrian wept, and ordered statues of him built across the empire. To leave them behind was to send a message. These sandals were worn by Nero's mistress, Poppaea Sabina, were taught to untie sandals with their mouths, a display of obedience, a theater of intimacy. That was enough. She ruled Rome from her feet. And yet she was not the only one. Made of thin fishskin or dyed goat hide, oiled to a shine, and felt the world tremble. Confessed to following the sound of those bells for 3 nights before his collapse? These shoes were barely there. Some had tiny bells sewn into the straps to signal presence or absence. Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, known for her infamy, Seneca wrote, "She walked upon men as she did upon marble." But not all seduction wore gold. The high courtesans of the Subura district, Rome's red-lit slum, favored transparent sandals. One senator, disgraced in 37 CE, their sandals were part of their power. In wealthier circles, noble women competed not just in beauty. Some sandals had secret compartments in the heel to hold scrolls, coins, keys, or poisons. Its blade was still sharp. But the most dangerous woman to ever wear sandals in Rome may have been Julia Domna, wife of Emperor Septimius Severus. Her sandals were stitched with astrological signs, and she claimed that wearing them allowed her to sense betrayal. Whether superstition or strategy, none dared test her. One of her sandals survives, preserved in a desert shrine. I tread upon those who deceive. Not all seductive sandals were made for women. Some young men, favorites of emperors, in each he wears those sandals. The sensuality of Roman sandals was not just in sight. It was in ritual. To untie a lover's sandal was a gesture of trust, a slow unlooping symbolic of surrender. Poets wrote of it. In the Amoras, Ovid pens, "Her sandal I slipped with shaking hand, and slaves, trained in the arts of pleasure, even the gods participated." Venus, goddess of love, was often depicted barefoot, but when shod, she wore silver sandals, bound with pearls. In one inscription found in Hispania, a woman wrote, "Venus, grant me a daughter with feet as graceful as yours." But not all was soft in this world of sandals and silk. Jealousy led to murder. Scandal toppled dynasties. One sandal left by a courtesan in the wrong bedchamber could doom a senator. One footprint in the emperor's garden could cause a purge. The very thing that adorned could also accuse. And so these sandals were not just worn, they were weapons. Of charm, of politics, of revenge. With them, Rome loved. With them, Rome bled. We have now walked through 12 of 17. But 5 still remain, and they are the rarest. Because next, we enter the world of death. In life, sandals carried soldiers across deserts. They bore senators into forums. They seduced, they ruled, they ran. But in death, they became symbols. To be buried with sandals was no mere practicality. It was a rite, a step into the afterlife. In Roman tradition, it was considered improper, even unlucky, to allow a body to cross into the underworld barefoot. Just as a Ramong never entered the forum without proper attire, so too was the soul expected to meet the god shod, not naked in the feet, not unmarked. Thus, the Romans invented the caligae mortuorum, the sandals of the dead. Dolphins, symbols of eternity, of journey, of safe passage. They were often simple. Thin leather, sometimes uncolored, but some bore elaborate patterns, vines, stars. In wealthier tombs, the dead were sometimes buried with gold-threaded sandals, woven with verses invoking the manes, the spirits of the ancestors. One pair, found in the catacombs of St. Priscilla, bore an inscription, "Tread softly, Lucius. The fields of Elysium await." But sandals did more than clothe the dead. They preserved their identity. Frequently, the dead piled in pits. One reed. The sandal, with its personalized buckle, its family crest stamped into the sole, often served as the only marker. When Rome suffered plagues, and they did, archaeologists discovered such sandals beneath layers of ash at Pompeii, some with tiny bronze tags attached. You will find sandals carved into marble, sometimes ornate, sometimes crude, always deliberate. The family would leave the shoes of the deceased untouched for a year. No one could wear them. They were considered sacred echoes. Each year, on her birthday, he would open it, touch the worn leather, and speak to her ghost. Property of Aelia Sabina, 13 years. She was found curled beside a fountain, her sandals still tied. of stepping into the pain left by the departed. In funeral processions, it was customary for the eldest son to remove his own sandals and walk barefoot behind the bier, a sign of mourning. Thin, frail, often red-dyed, the color of blood. And there were the sandals of cenotaphs, shoes not worn by the dead, but by stone statues that stood in their memory. If you ever walk through the remains of Roman graveyards, look closely. The foot frozen in stride, their straps are torn, their soleae cracked. But under layers of dirt, one name always remains. Others kissed their sandals before entering the arena. A few wrote their names on the soleae, hoping someone might remember them when the dust had settled. The strap, curling with false leather. Inside each hole, a strand of hair. A name carved into the leather. As if the statue could step down and walk away. His sandals were burned on a silver pyre beside his body. A symbol that the emperor had no further need of earthly paths. A poet later wrote, "The Romans believed that shoes carried memory. The paths walked in life remained imprinted in the soul." They would act out the last steps of their masters, imitating the dead in laughter and fear. That's why sandals were sometimes hung from the walls of a domus after a death. Aulus Gellius writes of a senator who, after his daughter died, kept her sandals in a sealed box. Others were burned, as if to release the soul trapped within. Not all dead were honored. Some were cast out without sandals, their feet bare to the underworld. This was a form of punishment reserved for traitors, oathbreakers, or slaves who rebelled. To deny someone sandals in death was to deny their peace. But the gladiators, they were a different tale. Before stepping into the arena, many gladiators were given ceremonial sandals called soleae damnati, sandals of the condemned. These were not made to last. To wear them was to accept fate. Some gladiators refused. At least a dozen of these sandals have been unearthed in amphitheaters. "Victor, let me walk again." Even emperors understood the power of the final step. When Hadrian died, his soul, now barefoot, walked the stars. And in the rituals of Saturnalia, slaves would wear the sandals of the dead in mock funeral games, part parody, part reverence. Some took it too far and never removed the sandals. Sandals of the dead have been found nailed to the walls of temples, left as offerings. Some were folded as if to sleep. One pair, found deep in a cave shrine in Gaul, was pierced with 30 tiny holes, a form of ancient curse, the sandals of vengeance, because not all deaths in Rome were mourned. Some were invoked, so we arrive at the threshold of silence. 13 types walked before us, some in glory, some in shame, some into war, others into bed sheets, and now into the grave. But there are 4 more to go. Next, we leave death behind and climb higher. Not into blood or dust, but into divinity. If the dead wore sandals into eternity, then the gods must have walked in eternal sandals. For all their myths and statues, the gods of Rome, borrowed, bent, and renamed from the Greeks, remained deeply human in how they were dressed, adorned, and imagined, and at their feet, always sandals, but not of this world. The Romans called him Mercurius, son of Maia, fast-tongued, faster-footed. He wore the talaria, the winged sandals. The most famous divine footwear belonged to Mercury, the god of travelers, messengers, and thieves. These were no ordinary shoes, made not of leather, but of wind. Strapped with gold, tipped with flight, he needed no road. He simply rose. Even Roman generals would sometimes wear winged motifs on their boots, invoking his swiftness before battle. The image of Mercury in his talaria became a motif across coins, mosaics, and sculpture, a god forever mid-step, hovering between heaven and earth. These lunar soleae were used in rituals of passion and marriage, but not all gods flew. A statue of Mars' altar in the form of Augustus shows, reserved only for the high priestess, the sacerdos veneris, who wore replicas when leading processions through Rome, him in sandals studded with obsidian and bronze fangs, as if each step bit into the battlefield. Mars, the god of war, strode in heavy iron-shod sandals called caligae divini, divine boots that cracked the earth beneath him. These were to never touch blood nor the ground outside the temple. The punishment was not fine or flogging, but exile. To dress like a god's servant was to lie to the gods themselves. and golden sandals with the sun carved into the soleae. If a vestal sandal was soiled, she was purified. If it was lost, it was burned. These sandals were tied in 9 knots, each symbolizing a sacred vow. Breaking a knot mid-ritual was an omen of famine. Venus, goddess of love, wore sandals of a different kind. As we saw earlier, her votive showed her barefoot. But in her temples she was often adorned with silver-laced sandals said to reflect the moonlight. Priests of her cult would wash her sandals in rosewater, whispering prayers over the straps. The ceremony was secret, and yet, for all their splendor, divine sandals were also dangerous. Some with platform soles up to 12 inches high. These cothurni, borrowed from Greek tragedy, elevated their wearers to appear larger than life. Statues of Augustus Divus, Trajan, and Antoninus Pius often depict them with subtly inhuman sandals, too perfect, too symmetrical with straps that formed celestial patterns. To wear the wrong sandal in a temple was to court sacrilege. To step where a god had stepped, without permission, could summon doom. The Arval Brethren, an elite priestly college, wore red sandals only when performing sacrifices to Didia, the goddess of growth. The Vestal Virgins, guardians of the eternal flame, wore white sandals of doeskin, known as soleae purae. There was a law in the time of Emperor Augustus forbidding any citizen from replicating priestly sandals. The priests claimed these allowed the wearer to walk between worlds. But beside him lies a pair of gilded sandals, untouched as if awaiting his return. They weren't meant for feet. They were footprints frozen in stone, marking where the god had once stood. Still, some tried. A marble relief found in Ostia shows a Kamen arrested for posing as a priest of Apollo. His disguise? A flowing robe, a stolen scroll. It wasn't the robe that betrayed him. It was the shoes. Sandals were also part of divine theater. During certain festivals, Saturnalia, Floralia, and the Grand Ludi Romani, actors portraying gods would be dressed in exaggerated sandals. Audiences believed the gods were present not just in words but in footprint and shadow. And when emperors died and were deified, they too were shown in divine sandals. One statue of Augustus from Prima Porta shows him barefoot, a nod to his now godly nature. Even in death, the emperor had the right to choose when to wear them. Temples across the empire kept divine sandals as relics. Some were never worn, only displayed. Others were used in sacred processions, carried by slaves on velvet cushions. In one temple of Jupiter in North Africa, archaeologists uncovered a pair of sandals carved from marble, not leather, permanently bound to the altar floor. Pilgrims kissed them. Some even buried offerings inside them, coins, rings, whispers of prayer. And in the cult of Isis, sandals took on magical power. Ritual texts describe the creation of sandals of rebirth, tied with 7 colored threads, worn during moonlit rites. One fragment reads, "Step thrice, heel to toe, leave no mark. The gods will open the gate." It may have been metaphor, or not. We'll never know how many walked into temples barefoot and came out changed. Because divine sandals were not just footwear. They were a declaration, not of power or wealth, but of proximity to the sacred. To wear them was to say, "I serve the gods. I speak their steps." Now we have walked among empires and tombs, among seduction and sacrifice. Only one chapter remains. Not sandals of men or gods or ghosts, but of the strange, the rare, the forgotten. In the deep cellar of Rome's forgotten history, past the records of emperors and wars, past the sandals of gods and gladiators, lies a peculiar chamber of curiosities, the sandals that should not exist. Some are myths, others hoaxes, a few inexplicably real. We begin with the sandals of the Sibyl. The Sibyls were ancient prophetesses, scattered across the Roman world, Delphi, Cumae, Tiber. Legends tell of one Sibyl who walked barefoot for a century. Her feet, it was said, left no mark. Until one day a sandal appeared beneath her, not placed but grown. Not leather, but bark. The tale claimed it was made from the tree of time, soaked in starlight, bound with wind. When the Sibyl died, the sandal vanished. Of course, no such sandal was found. These sandals left footprints that pointed away from the wearer. Pliny the Elder dismissed them as fantasy. But one mosaic in Ostia depicts a hooded figure walking toward a temple, while the footprints behind them walk away. But a pair of strange wooden soleae, curved upward at the toe, were discovered in a cave near Cumae. They bore no fastenings, only a single word burned into the arch. Wigi, I saw. Then there are the caligae inversi, the backward sandals. According to legend, Longinus converted, fled, and wandered barefoot until his death. His sandals, found in a jar, were said to bleed on Good Friday. Supposedly worn by spies, assassins, or witches, their sandals, if they existed, would be priceless relics. A 4th century hoard discovered near Palatine Hill claimed to contain them, 2 tiny pairs, 1 bronze, 1 silver, each marked with a Volf's head. Forgeries abounded. The most infamous was the sandal of Nero's madness, allegedly worn during the burning of Rome. One had a rusted nail embedded in the heel. When examined in 1897, the leather cracked open to reveal nothing but pilgrims still come. Coincidence? Artistic flourish? Or did someone really walk backward through Rome unseen? In the Middle Ages, monks in southern Gaul claimed to possess the sandals of St. Longinus, the Roman soldier who pierced Christ's side. Historians dismissed them as relic forgery, yet the sandals themselves were real, crude, wide-soled, made for marching. Among the bodies was a woman buried with a pair of sandals made not of leather, but woven human hair. Thick, dark, coiled into braided soleae. And then there are the sandals of the twins. Roman myth speaks of Romulus and Remus, suckled by a she-wolf, founders of the city. They were later proven to be 2nd century toys, miniature sandals, for a shrine. Still, the story persisted, and the museum exhibit reads, or were they meant to carry the dead across the Styx? Possibly the first steps of Rome. The body had decomposed, but one sandal remained upright, toe pointing north. Each morning, the workers claimed it had shifted slightly. Tells of a fisherman in the Aegean who found a pair of sandals drifting atop the waves. They never sank. He tied them to his boat, but they floated beside him. When he brought them ashore, they disintegrated. Hoaxes became common during the Renaissance as interest in Roman antiquity surged. It was red-dyed, singed at the strap, with a ruby set into the toe, a symbol of divine fire. But the ruby was glass. The leather was goat, not calf. And the stitching bore 14th century patterns. That each sole records more than distance, that shoes dream. You can hear the faint scuff of leather, as if the feet that wore them have returned. Still, the idea stuck. Nero, watching flames, sandals glowing beneath his robe. It was a compelling lie. Some sandals are stranger still. In 1933, a Roman crypt was excavated beneath modern-day lion hair sandals. Never before seen. No records in Roman texts, a cult, a punishment, a final gesture of grief, we may never know. And what of the floating sandals? A story from the 2nd century CE, he claimed they belonged to Proteus, the shape-shifting sea god. Of course, it was dismissed as nonsense. But similar sandals made of cork and fishskin have been found in coastal graves, likely used in sea burials. Practical? Ceremonial? Perhaps the most haunting case is the sandal that walks alone. In the early 1800s, a Roman grave was unearthed in Britain. They marked it. Over 9 nights, the sandal turned exactly 180 degrees. By the 10th day, it pointed south. The site was closed. The sandal, now in storage, has not moved since. And yet, some claim that all sandals carry memory, not just of steps taken, but of intentions never fulfilled. It is said that in certain shrines, when the wind is still, not as ghosts, but as echoes, 17 types, we have walked with emperors, fallen beside gladiators, knelt before gods, lingered with the dead, trembled with mystery, all through sandals, not armor, not swords, but humble straps, leather and rope, broken and repaired, left behind and passed on. Rome did not march on marble alone. It walked on solace,